Hello, it's Jeff Sachs here, Director of the United Nations Sustainable Development Solutions Network and Professor of Sustainable Development at Columbia University. And I want to thank our Japanese hosts for the 2019 T20 Inception meeting, and especially ADBI, the Institute for International Monetary Affairs, and the Japan Institute for International Affairs for leading us in the coming year in the G20 process. I've felt for many years that the T20 process is extremely important because the world's think tanks have a major role to play in helping to guide governments to be more effective and also to hold governments accountable for global responsibilities, global commitments that have been made, and the needs for effectiveness in implementation of policies. We've just concluded the G20 process in Buenos Aires. Our T20 institutions in Argentina did an exceptionally fine job in gathering the world's think tanks during the past year, and I really want to congratulate this wonderful accomplishment, and I know that Japan and the lead institutions will also do a wonderful job in 2019. I'm sorry to say that the think tanks are doing a lot better job than our governments are doing. I think that the truth is that the G20 this year was without any result that I can gather except in avoiding a disaster. Maybe that's true these days because of the U.S. government as being a loner in international politics right now, and so everybody just wants to get through a meeting without Donald Trump creating some kind of crisis. But this is a pretty minimal standard. The fact that the G20 success amounts to not having a trade disaster between the U.S. and China, it's not a small thing, but it's hardly an accomplishment of our critical need for progress in sustainable development and in promoting the objectives of the Paris Climate Agreement. On that count, I think one can only be really profoundly disappointed because the G20 communique is a bunch of cliches. There's not one meaningful number in the document. There is not one single financial commitment. There is not one single metric, standard, recognition of a quantitative need, pledge to do something other than another study, another nice declaration. In other words, another meeting with words, and I would say, other than avoiding disaster, no action. And when it comes to climate change, of course, we have a quite serious watering down of what governments are doing and of any sense of reality. In a period where we need deep, rapid decarbonization to avoid disaster, and even with that we might not avoid disaster, the statement in paragraph 22 of the communique that we acknowledge the role of all energy sources and technologies in the energy mix and different possible national paths to achieve cleaner energy systems under the terms transitions is, frankly, a complete abnegation of responsibility. It's just a bow to the fossil fuel producing and exporting countries in the G20, especially the United States. It's not meaningful. There's no recognition of the dire shortfall of actions, as was just again shown in the UNEP study of the nationally determined contributions in comparison with the commitments made in the Paris Climate Agreement. There's no mention in here of countless other crucial issues. There's no discussion of climate financing. There's no discussion with just days to go before the COP in Katowice, Poland, of the still missing $100 billion per year commitment by the developed countries to support the developing countries in climate finance. We know that it's almost a farce because the developed countries want to count almost anything in that $100 billion, whether it's additional or not, whether it's about climate finance or not, whether it's a grant or a loan, whether it's commercial or private. It's a shame what's going on. There was no discussion in the communique about the dire shortfall of official development assistance, nor any recognition of the critical financing gaps for many of the objectives that are mentioned in the communique. Access to health coverage, access to education, ending hunger. But our governments are either so soft or so self-deceiving or so cynical or so uninterested that they seem absolutely impervious to the fact that as they state these objectives, we're way off track. We are not getting closer to being on track. Meeting after meeting repeats the same cliches, and yet there's no real attempt to understand what needs to be done, how actions need to be scaled up, how much that would cost, who would pay for that. In other words, the real nuts and bolts of true fiscal policy, financial policy, development policy. All of that is swept aside in loose statements about the wonderful things that our governments are committed to doing. There's no sense of the race to the bottom in corporate tax collections, which of course has accelerated this past year with the United States corporate tax cuts being followed by corporate tax cuts undertaken in other countries. And in the Buenos Aires update on the G20 commitments to the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, I'm looking at it here, not a single number, not a single piece of analysis of the profound gaps of our stated goals and our actual trajectories and the responsibilities of the G20 countries in actually restoring some sense of reality to the path that we need to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. So I believe that we really are faced with an enormous challenge. Our governments have some mix of lack of interest, total focus on short-run internal politics, lack of realism about financing because they don't want to spend money on global goods like climate financing or development assistance to end extreme poverty. They don't want to be bothered. Maybe they fear their taxpayers, though I think they just can't be bothered. And a profound lack of capacity to connect actions with goals. Almost, if one were looking at this as an individual, you would say a complete irrationality, because the goals are stated time and again, and there doesn't seem to be any attempt to connect actual policies with the achievement of the goals. If you want to say that it's not irrationality, one would have to argue that it's extreme laziness and extreme cynicism. So, what are we to do? As think tanks, what are we to do? I believe, and I'll speak for the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, our job is partly analytical, to understand how the goals that we've set can be achieved. If we have said that we're trying to stay well below 2 degrees Celsius, what does that mean for the actions by countries? If we say we're aiming to stay below 1.5 degrees C in the Paris Climate Agreement, what does that actually mean for the time, the pace, the energy mix that countries need to have? That is an analytical exercise. A second part is a financial and fiscal exercise. Put your money where your mouth is, meaning that if there are goals for decarbonization or goals for universal health coverage or goals for universal access to education, pay for it. What does it cost? What are the budget lines? Who's financing it? And this, the G20 seems to be unwilling utterly to do. But that's what SDSN is spending a lot of time on, identifying budgetary needs and responsibilities and the needs for the rich countries to put forward what they are obligated to do, which is the development assistance to make it possible to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. So that's a second issue, the analytics, the financing, and the third is the metrics. We need to measure, not in cliches, but in actual policy steps and actual outcomes, how the G20 countries are progressing on decarbonization, on other environmental damage reduction, on their financial obligations to the poor countries, and we need timely metrics published in time for all of the G20 countries to receive them, the governments to receive them, and the press and the public to receive them. And this is the commitment that I have for the SDSN. We will be providing systematic metrics of what governments are doing and especially what they're not doing, what they're paying for and especially what they're not paying for before the G20 meeting. And I welcome all other think tanks that are interested to contact me and to join us in this important work, because accountability is absolutely essential. So the steps of policy analytics, of financial and fiscal analysis, and of metrics and accountability will be our 3-point agenda in the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network. And I would love to work with think tanks all over the world in this great T20 process to carry this out. But we're not going to let the governments get away with this intellectual dishonesty and intellectual casualness when the stakes in the world are so high. Finally, I would remind all of you that 2019 is a very, very crucial year for the global scene. We have 2 very important head of state summits in September. This is in addition, of course, to the G20 meeting itself. One of those meetings will be the high-level review of the Sustainable Development Goals at the United Nations. And the second will be the Secretary General's Climate Summit. Again, a crucial meeting to push countries to accelerate their progress and their financing of climate control, especially in the year before the 5th anniversary of the Paris Climate Agreement, when all countries are supposed to deepen their national commitments, and when we have to really fight hard, so that the United States does not withdraw from the Paris Climate Agreement, an absolutely disgraceful proposal of President Trump, who every day shows his abusive disgrace of the climate realities on the planet, which are harming the whole world and frankly are completely reckless and corrupt also, because they reflect the power of the oil industry in the United States in corrupting our policies. So we have these two high-level summits that are extremely important. We have the replenishment of the Global Fund to fight AIDS, TB, and malaria, which will be hosted by France, and which is essential that this be properly funded, perhaps $25 to $30 billion needed over the next 3 years to put the world on the path to end these epidemic diseases. So the name of the game, I believe, is specificity, is deep analysis, and is holding our governments accountable for all that they are not doing. That's what thinking institutions can do. There are a lot of great institutions in the T20. Please, let's join together to hold governments accountable to their cliches, but to turn the cliches into real action. Well, thank you very much for letting me join the meeting by video. I wish I could be in Tokyo. I'm, in fact, on my way to Katowice, and I wish everybody the best, and I look forward to being with you in Japan in 2019. Thank you again for hosting this important Inception meeting, and thank you again for your wonderful leadership. Goodbye.